From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's today's lineup. K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz will take up two timely crop fertility management topics. He'll look at applying anhydrous ammonia to corn crop ground here in the fall. He'll also look at the question of whether the recent wet weather has caused nitrogen losses in newly planted winter wheat stands. Also, segments from this week's Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State, which looks this time at the economics of cattle traceability. Featured are K-State's Bob Larson, Brad White, and Dustin Pendell. They're joined by the program manager of the new Cattle Trace pilot project in Kansas, Cassie Kniebel. And further ahead with his weekly commentary on rural Kansas, K-State's Gus Vander Hoeven. All this and more right here on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Thanks for listening. You're tuned to Agriculture Today. Crop nutrient management is what we're about on this first part of the broadcast, and more directly, the opportunity for you corn growers to get a head start on your 2019 crop management with a fall application of anhydrous ammonia to that ground, which will be likely planted to corn this coming spring. We've welcomed back in Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, nutrient management specialist with K-State Research and Extension, to offer a few thoughts on this. And the general thought behind putting anhydrous down in the fall, what drives this, Dorivar?
Yes, Eric, there's a lot of benefits for sure. By fall application of anhydrous ammonia, of course, we can spread out the workload a little bit better by doing this application in the fall rather than waiting until the spring. And also, we may have better conditions in the fall for this anhydrous application. Some years in the spring we may not have enough time, and conditions may not be very good for anhydrous applications as well. And that may require application of other sources of nitrogen that are typically a little bit higher price. So we really want to take advantage of using lower price anhydrous and again, giving us a little bit more flexibility in the fall for this application. So we do have several potential benefits with this application.
And anhydrous ammonia as a nitrogen source tends to be more stable in the soil, does it not, compared to the other types of N that might be put down?
Yes, that's another benefit, and perhaps one of the reasons why we can definitely consider a fall application of anhydrous ammonia. There are really a few different factors contributing to this stability basically in the soil. First of all, just the product itself, anhydrous ammonia, basically tends to be self-inhibitable, if you will, because it's basically reducing the population of microbial population and activity in the point of injection for that anhydrous ammonia. So that's basically slow down any nitrification process in general. And also the form of nitrogen tends to be more stable. Of course, we are putting ammonia as NH3 that basically converts to ammonium NH4 basically immediately after application. And that ammonium form tends to be pretty stable in the soil. It's not subject to leaching because it has a positive charge. So it's typically don't move much in the soil. So that's a big advantage. And again, if we do a fall application and we keep in mind things like temperature, microbial activity, which is the next step that basically convert that ammonium into nitrate, will typically be slower. And again, that's a big advantage for us in terms of minimizing any potential loss. As we know, the main risk of nitrogen losses are associated with nitrate forms, the NO3 form, which is, again, subject to either leaching or denitrification in some soils.
So the focus really is on the soil temperature at application time and what's expected afterward, and there is a threshold after which it's fairly safe to put anhydrous down, you say.
Yes, and again, as we have this process of nitrification from ammonium to nitrate is really a microbial-driven process, then, of course, soil temperature is a key factor. We typically consider 50 degrees Fahrenheit at 4-inch depth in the soil as a threshold that we typically try to watch for as point where it's typically safer to do anhydrous application, again, because that microbial activity tends to slow down significantly below that temperature, and we can maintain most of that nitrogen in the ammonium form, which, again, is more stable and not subject to any leaching losses in the soil.
And in fact, before you came over, you checked once again with the latest from the Weather Data Library at K-State, and note that our soil temperatures, by and large, around Kansas have now dipped below that 50-degree mark, which would allow for this application.
Yes. If we look at that soil temperature, again, we want to look at the 4-inch depth, and we want to also look at the average temperature for the last week, the last 7 days. And at this point, basically the entire state of Kansas is below 50 degrees. And in some parts of northern Kansas, we're actually approaching about 40 degrees temperature. So we are to the point that we can basically apply anhydrous to most soils. There are some situations that we still have to keep in mind, things like soil texture. If we are dealing with very sandy soils, we want to take other precautions. In some situations, it will probably be best to wait until the spring in those soils where may be subject to leaching even with low soil temperatures. And in some cases, we may want to consider using things like nitrification inhibitors to minimize that nitrification process and minimize any potential losses. Because it's very important to keep in mind, even though we are recommending anhydrous application once the soil temperature is below 50 degrees, that doesn't mean that the nitrification process is stopped completely. The nitrification process still continues, but typically it's going to be a very low rate. But again, if we do have warmer temperatures later on, or if we have a warmer spring, this process will continue, and again, it could speed up also in the spring.
So your point there is, even if you are applying on a medium or fine-textured soil, it might still be worthwhile to use a nitrification inhibitor product.
Yes, it still could be a benefit in those kind of situations, but especially, again, in sandy soils is really what we want to focus. And again, if we think about Kansas, especially central, western Kansas, drier conditions, basically most of our winter months are basically the driest during the year. So potential for losses tends to be, in general, lower. And that's another advantage that we do have in Kansas with our rainfall distribution. But again, in sandy soils, we always do have a little bit of a risk, especially in the spring, and using things like nitrification inhibitors or even waiting for anhydrous application in the spring could be much more beneficial in those soils.
Dorivar, we've yet to talk about application rates. What guidelines are practical for this fall application purpose?
Yes, of course, we want to start with soil sampling before application, and many producers at this point already collected profile residual nitrogen. We know there's very good correlation between residual nitrogen and yield the next year for corn. So that's a key point that we need to keep in mind. We have that information that's going to go into basically fine-tuning our application rates. Other factors such as organic matter is very important. So again, that soil test give us that guideline, and of course yield potential, what we expect in next year. All of those are key components to estimating the application rates for corn. And one can apply anhydrous well into the late fall, early winter, as long as the ground is thawed, right? Absolutely. Again, at this point, we're really looking at that soil temperature. Like we mentioned, we are basically below 50 degrees. At this point, we basically can do applications anytime if soil conditions are good.
So producers, as you're thinking ahead to your corn production in 2019, you might gain some efficiency by putting that anhydrous ammonia down here in the fall, and your local extension office can provide you further guidelines on that. While you're here, Dorivar, a quick mention as well, as we're talking about nitrogen applications. The soils have been rather saturated in Kansas since early October, and for those who planted winter wheat and put nitrogen down with that planting, is there a concern about that N leaching away from that crop?
In some conditions, that could be a possibility. Of course, producers who are doing most of the application as top dress, this is not an issue and not a concern. But for some producers that do 100% of the nitrogen pre-plant, this could be a concern. We have to keep in mind things like soil texture, again, conditions where we have a little bit more of a sandy soils. Maybe we did have some leaching in that kind of scenario. So those are fields that we have to be watching very closely. One alternative to monitor that is to basically implement some enriched strips. These are basically areas of the field where you can basically just put a little extra nitrogen and basically monitor that area, see how things look compared to the rest of the field next spring when the weeds start to green up. So that's one alternative for those fields that already got all the nitrogen and especially, again, those more of a sandy soil situations. Other soils, other systems where we are putting all top dress application, maybe a little bit of nitrogen this fall, I'm not too concerned about those fields. We have to keep in mind that wheat is not taking up a lot of nitrogen this fall. Most of that nitrogen is going to take up basically after green up, and so we don't really need a lot of nitrogen. And even if we have a little bit of nitrogen losses this fall, I don't think that will affect significantly growth and establishment this fall. And again, we're coming back with a top dress application, which is the ideal situation. So in that kind of scenario, I don't think it's a concern. And definitely consider putting an enriched strip as a reference in that field to just see how things look next spring.
In essence, keep an eye on it, but hopefully not a major problem.
Hopefully not a major problem. And one thing also that we have to keep in mind is that this moisture may contribute to some leaching, but also moisture help with mineralization. In other words, we can maybe have an extra nitrogen coming from organic matter from the good moisture conditions that we have. So that's something that in some years where we have dry conditions, we may not see that mineralization happening. So that's a positive as well that we need to watch.
Very well. As a matter of fact, there are 2 e-update articles in the recent series posted on the topics here: nitrogen loss potential from wheat fields this fall, and again, the considerations for fall applications of anhydrous ammonia on corn ground, and that's found at agronomy.ksu.edu once again by clicking on the e-update tab. And we appreciate you coming over and sharing all of this, Dorivar. Thank you.
Thank you.
He's a nutrient management specialist, K-State Research and Extension out of the Department of Agronomy. That's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. And we'll return shortly with more on Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
This is Agriculture Today, and next up for you, a conversation about beef cattle traceability, revolving around the new pilot project underway here in Kansas, managed in large part by the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. It's called by name Cattle Trace, and on the latest BCI Cattle Chat podcast, veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larson and livestock economist Dustin Pendell were joined by the project manager, Cassie Kniebel, who's been right here with us on the broadcast before outlining Cattle Trace for us. The economic side of cattle traceability earns extra attention this time around. Here's Brad.
Dustin, I know you've done quite a bit with traceability. You want to tell us about some of your stuff?
Yes, pretty much been doing traceability, well, back to my graduate school days when I was here at K-State, where we looked at kind of the impacts of having different levels of traceability and how fast it could trace back in a disease spread, and then from there obviously focus on the economics. And since then we've done, once I graduated, left, went up to Colorado State, got involved right when I got there with some folks in the animal science department, where we were looking at what were the impacts, both could you do it and what would the cost be for traceability in packing plants and rendering plants. And we visited almost 70 plants across the U.S. and Canada.
Well, it is kind of interesting because as a veterinarian, I think about traceability a lot of times about disease control and being able to, get a disease under control, stamp it out, minimize the effect. But you're, as an ag economist, you're really, and actually probably the disease control part of it's going to come quicker than getting market back again. And that's kind of your interest?
So yeah, in all aspects, right? You got producers who obviously are going to be impacted directly, and so those that are directly impacted with maybe losing animals or animals that are infected, you got those impacts. But then you've got other producers who might be on the other side of the country who aren't directly.
Their animals don't have disease, but they're still
indirectly,
harmed.
when you don't have markets, that's a huge economic impact. And so we kind of come about that looking at, I guess, all the different levels where you're talking the producers that are impacted versus not, all the way to the consumers and everybody in between. And so worked on that project, followed that up with another USDA-funded project looking at the benefits costs of National Animal Identification System, which eventually went away after we finished that project. And then USMEF actually commissioned a study with a couple of my colleagues, Ted Schroeder, Glenn Tonzer, I believe Gary Brester at Montana State, and Kevin Duvetter, who's no longer at K-State. And we looked at more from the export market impacts. And then so that was probably done in 2011. Since then, it just kind of disappeared, the traceability, until more recently.
What were some of your take-homes there? You said you looked at cost-benefit, both from a disease transmission standpoint to the producers and access to markets. What were, in broad terms, maybe not specific numbers, but broad terms, what did you find?
A lot of came back to having a traceability. Does it open up markets faster? Because having export market access is huge when you think about.
So if there's a disease event, you get
disease or anything really, but we're focused obviously on the disease aspect of it. But yes, if you can open export markets faster because of traceability, that has huge economic impacts. Or if you can actually just gain access to additional markets, don't worry about the disease aspect of it. If you can just gain access to them, then that's pretty large economic impacts. It's getting access to the export markets. Furthermore, there are also consumer impacts, right? If they all of a sudden feel more confident or they want to pay more for traceable products, again, that has another economic impact.
And as far as we're thinking domestically, what does the rest of the world look like? Did you look at that in your research?
So we did, and we've done that in a couple of those studies as we looked around who's doing traceability, mandatory, voluntary, individual, group, et cetera. And we're definitely one of the, as being a large producer, a large importer, a large exporter of, let's say, beef, we're one of the few countries that don't have a traceability system. We got Brazil and Australia, Canada. There are countries in Africa. Last time I was in Ethiopia, which is probably a year and a half ago, they were just kicking off a traceability pilot project as well. So there's
pretty common throughout the world, and lots of good reasons to have those.
Right, whether it's from a traceability or a disease standpoint, or a lot of these countries, especially in Africa, they're mostly interested in the export markets, like Australia and Canada.
Yep. Cattle Trace, that's the traceability program that has started here. So Cassie, can you tell us a little bit about that program?
Yes, so started probably about 9 months ago, I think, is kind of when it got up and running. So disease traceability is the focus of this system, and Dustin kind of alluded to, value add type of opportunities with the traceability system. But we have maintained that focus on disease traceability. As the WPI report kind of highlights, in order to get something implemented across the country, we kind of have to focus on that piece.
Absolutely.
Yeah, one of the things, as a veterinarian, I work some with the state veterinarian here in Kansas and other places, and I know that state veterinarians, those whose job it is to identify and track down disease outbreaks that are of concern, that they've been asking for a traceability program for a long time. So adult animals that move across state lines, they have to be tagged and their numbers are included on a health certificate and those types of things. So it's not correct to say we have no traceability in the United States, but young feeder cattle currently are not being traced.
Yes. So talking to Dr. Justin Smith, our Animal Health Commissioner, he will tell you that the animals that fall under the ADT rule today, so those older...
ADT, Animal Disease Traceability Rule.
Yes. So the Animal Disease Traceability Rule today, so those older animals, they are traceable because they are required to be.
Right.
But the feeder cattle aren't under that rule. So the cattle trace system focuses on feeder cattle and trying to determine how to fill that gap and how to make those cattle traceable. In the event of a disease outbreak, it's a fairly manual type of system because it's not required. Mm-hmm. And so it can take months to even years to trace some of those cattle.
What are the objectives of that pilot project?
So we have three main objectives. The first is to develop a purpose-built infrastructure for a disease traceability system. So that includes what technology do we use, where do we place the readers, getting participants at each production segment. And then the second objective is to test that system and evaluate the efficiencies and capabilities of that system. And then the third is kind of the economics. So what are the costs and the benefits, the value at each production segment, but then also across the industry?
And one of the novel things about this, and I think as going through achieving those objectives, is the focus of this pilot project is really on that infrastructure and how it works. And the analogy that I've used is similar to going down the interstate and there's a reader that's put up there. It's relatively hands-free. So once the reader's in place...
For them to send me the bill for going down the turnpike.
Exactly. If you're going down the turnpike, you have a reader and you've got a tag on your vehicle. You have to place the tag on the vehicle, but then as you're reading, you can go through it 70 miles an hour and you get multiple reads depending on how many readers you go past. And that's the concept for this system, is relatively hands-free. Mm-hmm. So in this case... what we're looking to do is find, as those cattle go through the phases of the system, and then as we get some of that information, we start to test how well does that work, how efficiently is it. Who's participating in this project?
So we have participants from kind of each key producer segment. So we have packers, so 3 major packers in Kansas on board, 14 feed yards in Kansas, 7 auction markets, and several cow-calf producers at this point. We've distributed over 23,000 tags now, so our goal is 55,000 in the state of Kansas. So we have a ways to go. We are really looking for those cow-calf participants in areas that surround our participating auction markets, which you can find that list on cattletrace.org. Our goal is to build a data set. So build a data set that we can test, kind of that second objective, and do mock traceback exercises. And we are really needing that cow-calf level.
And so right when I first heard about cattle trace, my first question is, why is this different?
Why is it different?
So I'm going to pose that question to you, Cassie. I mean, from what you've talked with all the different producers and everybody, what do you get a sense why it's different today than it was 15 years ago?
I think that one of the key differences is the technology. So over the past 15 years, there has been low-frequency RFID technology. Now there's ultra-high-frequency technology, which is... it allows us to read multiple groups of cattle at a time. So they can walk through an alleyway system and we can read them. They don't have to run through a chute individually in order to read them or run through a narrow alleyway.
You don't have to have the same... Most of us picture an electronic ID. You're picturing a wand, a calf, and a chute, and you're scanning his ear tag in some way. And with this system, you can be farther away. So you can still scan him in a chute, but you can be farther away, also scan him in an alleyway, walking across.
Well, I think it's pretty easy to think about the things that have changed in the last 15 years as far as the tag technology, because that wasn't available until very recently. Computing power to get that information in and sort it out. Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi was really in its infancy 15 years ago. So there's a lot of technology that we almost forget how...
it's a comfort level.
Yeah, we're so comfortable with that now, but it didn't really exist 15 years ago.
I've been told that kind of the overall sentiment from the industry has changed to be more positive for a traceability system. And that's helpful, especially, I think we've seen that from a participation standpoint, and we've had a lot of interest, whether it's from in Kansas or out of state, and so we're hoping that this thing can grow.
From the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State, Brad White, Bob Larson, Dustin Pendell, and special contributor Cassie Kniebel, the project manager of Cattle Trace, about which you can learn more at cattletrace.org, and hear the full BCI Cattle Chat podcast at beefcattleinsitute.org. You're tuned to Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you as we move on now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Because of the observance of Veterans Day this past Monday, the USDA pushed back one day its weekly crop progress and condition report. And for the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture supplies here in Kansas rated at 20% surplus and 78% adequate, only 2% short to very short. Subsoil moisture at 13% surplus, 82% adequate, and only 5% short to very short. The condition of the Kansas winter wheat crop this week is at 44% good to excellent, 42% fair, and 14% poor to very poor. Winter wheat planting at 90% now, still behind the average of 98% for the date, and emergence is at 77% behind the 89% average. As for the harvest progress, corn harvest is now 89% complete, still behind the 95% average. Kansas soybeans harvested at 74%, behind the 90% average. And grain sorghum harvested 62%, well behind the 80% average for this date. Now, the nation's soybean harvest is slower than the corn harvest, as we hear now from this report from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey points to delays in the nation's soybean harvest.
In fact, soybean harvest during the week was even slower than corn, just moving forward 5 percentage points from 83 to 88% complete.
This number is behind the 5-year average and the pace at the same time last year, which were both 93%.
And we see harvest delays of at least 10 percentage points behind the respective state 5-year averages in 5 of the 18 major production states. Those are Arkansas, Kansas, Michigan, Missouri, and Ohio.
Kansas is the state that's furthest behind.
74% of the soybeans harvested, 5-year average there is 90%.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Critics of the USDA's plans to relocate 2 research agencies out of D.C. next year are urging a special provision in an upcoming spending bill to put those moves on hold. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue has proposed relocating the Economic Research Service and the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. This delay is necessary in order for Congress and stakeholders to understand the ramifications of the USDA's proposed moves. That's how it was proposed by a coalition of 60 groups, including the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, Agricultural and Applied Economics Association, and the Consumer Federation of America. This was expressed in their letter. Nearly 140 cities are interested in hosting the ERS and NIFA, according to a list of applicants published by the USDA. The department plans to pick a new location or locations for the agencies by January. Meanwhile, USDA's Inspector General is currently reviewing whether the department has the authority to move the agencies and if proper procedures were followed. One of the key audiences for positive information about beef is influencers. Todd Domer reports here a group of culinary influencers recently were hosted in Kansas City for a workshop on breaking down primals into cuts that can be put on a menu.
The Kansas Beef Council recently hosted area chefs and culinary students for a beef merchandising workshop at a culinary school in the heart of Kansas City. Chicago-based master butcher and James Beard-nominated author of The Art of Cutting Beef, Carrie Underley, led the workshop. She broke down the chuck square cut, beef rib, and the whole bone-in sirloin. These beef items were selected to educate attendees on the value of purchasing large primals and fabricating them into plate-ready cuts. Chefs and students were provided a visual on all of the popular food service cuts from these primals, including recommendations on how to add value and creativity to the menu. In addition, Underley talked about beef bones with the class. She specifically addressed bones with marrow versus those without. Bones are the foundation for great beef broths and bases used to create soups and stews. Chefs evaluated broth styles made from marrow bones and non-marrow bones to appraise the difference in color, taste, and flavor. At the end of the checkoff-funded workshop, more than 30 beef cuts had been fabricated and flavor bones identified, with menu opportunities discussed for each. Chefs and students left the class with an understanding of where common and less traditional beef menu cuts are found, and many new merchandising ideas for building variety and creativity on the menu. I'm Todd Domer.
A few calendar items to bring to your attention, including one that's coming up imminently. That is the 2018 Swine Day here at Kansas State University. It is set for tomorrow, November the 15th. It'll kick off with the Technology Trade Show at 8 o'clock in the morning at the K-State Alumni Center here on the campus. Then during the morning session, K-State faculty will be giving updates on the latest pork research impacting you producers, that in 15-minute rotations. They'll cover topics on swine nutrition, management, feed processing, and feed safety. The afternoon program will feature two individuals from the Kansas Department of Agriculture, David Hogg and Sarah McReynolds. They'll be discussing the benefits of implementing secure pork supply for producers. And from the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory out of Iowa State University, Roger Main will cover emerging diseases and how diagnostic labs are adapting to help you producers. The program itself begins at 9:30, including lunch, and the day will wrap up with the reception at 3:30 tomorrow afternoon. Registration, $50, and that can be taken care of at the door. Students may attend free of charge if they register right away. You can register at ksuswine.org, but the best bet at this point, at this late date, is to call Lois Schreiner directly to reserve your spot at the Swine Day. Her number is 785-532-1267. Again, call Lois at 785-532-1267, and we hope to see you at the 2018 Swine Day here at Kansas State University at the K-State Alumni Center starting tomorrow morning. And K-State has several corn schools for you producers coming up in the early part of 2019 in Saline, Thomas, and Douglas counties the early part of January. And then in February, Labette County, Harvey County, and Finney County. They'll be getting into a number of timely topics on improving your corn production and management. You can go to agronomy.ksu.edu to find out more about these, and there'll be details on speakers and topics coming soon. But have it in mind, those K-State corn schools coming up early in 2019. This is Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen. This is our state, Kansas.
But then I would not have asked. I was just a small child in awe of him.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Language is fascinating. Words have meaning. Words bring up images. What amazes me is that sometimes the words in different languages are the same or nearly the same. Other times, the word for the same object is totally different. Take the chair we sit on. The Dutch word is stoel. However, table in Dutch is tafel. My grandfather from my father's side studied the Dutch words and sayings. I wonder if somehow I have a touch of his genes. I have a picture of him in my mind standing against the light. There are no details, just a silhouette. And of course, there are a few photos. But I did not know him. The word horizon has fascinated me. Of course, its meaning holds my attention, but also the fact that in Dutch, the word horizon is spelled exactly the same, Horizon, but it is pronounced horizon, with emphasis on the first syllable. Interesting. Why are these two words the same in a different language? My grandfather would have known and would have explained it to me. But then I would not have asked. I was just a small child in awe of him, a man I did not know. During my life I've seen horizons, and I think they are intriguing. Crossing the Atlantic and Pacific by boat, I saw horizons. On the Pacific between Australia and New Zealand, between New Zealand and Tahiti, and between Tahiti and Balboa. Slowly steaming along, you wonder if you ever will catch the horizon. The closest you will ever get is when you finally sail into harbor. It starts with one morning when you get on deck and you see this far-off tiny shimmer of land way in front of you with a cloud formation over it. Often you see the clouds first. It will take a long time yet to get there. Then finally, maybe the next day, you enter the harbor of Papeete, of Balboa, going the next leg. Around you, the ocean shows only horizons, and in the evening, a setting sun, which, if you stand at the railing to watch it sink, will show as a long, extended copper ribbon in the sea, if it is calm. The sinking sun seems to be the horizon, but you know better. Driving through across western Kansas, I've watched the horizons just as I did in Australia by disc plowing, the wheat fields up and down for days with a Massey Harris 55. As you turned, you looked at the horizon. You never actually catch the horizon. Yes, on the ocean maybe when you sail into the harbor, the small speck which ever so slowly got bigger. But beyond, there's still the horizon. In western Kansas it is the same. As you move forward, the horizon slips back. On a map you know what's beyond, and on your property you know the boundaries, and you know your neighbors, your community. But out west, you live and work in the land of horizons. As you work the land, you're familiar with your horizons. It does not change much when you climb up on the seat of the combine. It's only a few more feet up from the ground. However, if you ever climb to the top of the elevator, your horizon will be a little further away. That is, if there's no heavy fog, or rain squall, or snowstorm blowing. But even if it is, you know in your mind your horizons. That dawned on me when the twins visited the other day. My grandson met his wife, Cassidy, and the twins. Henry and Gus drove up last Thursday. It was the day it snowed. We watched the snow coming down from inside the house, where it was warm and cozy. The twins, now going on 20 months, had the big living room to explore. The basement door was closed, so they could not sail down. All non-touchables had been moved before and were out of reach. Of course, the big old grandfather clock intrigued them every time it chimed. The clock, ticking time, past and future. By winding up the clock each morning, pulling up its heavy weight just as my mom did, there's the past I know. The past which is recorded, the past which is history, and we can talk about the memories. But when I pull up the weight, I'm handling the future. I don't know what will happen in the 12 or 20 hours to come. or the other clock which has weights that make time for 7 days. Think about it. You pull the weights and the clock is wound for future time. It's time we don't know yet, just like the horizon. Sitting in my chair, sipping coffee, I study the twins, who are just starting to talk, but surely know what they want. When they all left later in the afternoon, I sat down, replaced, and pulled books back, and straightened the long rows. They're Dutch books. I thought about the meaning of the word horizon. What will their horizon be like? Who will they become? When I know them now, I know their dad, my grandson, know his dad, my son, know myself, I hope, have known my father, and have known my grandfather, or at least have known of my grandfather. It's all past, and now the clock chimes forward. We're moving to the horizon. As we get older, it seems our horizons are getting closer. But except for safe harbors, we will never reach it until we each reach our own horizon. Only then will we catch it. Will we know?
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on rural Kansas. Thanks for listening in today. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.